introduction. Thank you everyone for coming today. It's really a thrill to be back on campus since I graduated. It's only my third time back. Once was for my girlfriend's graduation, who's now my wife. The next time was randomly passing through on my way from Boston to visit family back in Western Connecticut, and my third time is today. It was a lot easier the first two times to come to campus, but now with some eyes on me and to talk a little bit about my research, I'm excited to meet you all and to talk with you a little bit about my book. As Professor Hedinger said, is called Marijuana: A Short History. Not an area of research that I thought I would be studying. When I graduated from here 11 years ago, if you told me I would be a voice talking about marijuana, at least on the policy front, I would have laughed at you. At first I never thought I'd really be studying public policy, no matter this one, but now it's an exciting part of my research agenda. It's one I also never thought my parents would be so excited that I was doing something involving marijuana, but shockingly they are. And it's something that tends to be a more interesting topic than what I normally study, which is the bureaucracy. It tends to be a little drier, a little more boring, and I get to sort of connect the two. And the reason for that is we have 28 states in the District of Columbia right now that have legalized medical marijuana. We now have 8 states in the District of Columbia, 8 states now after Tuesday that have legalized recreational adult use marijuana. And states go into this usually because of grassroots petitions that eventually become ballot initiatives and turned into public policy. And part of transforming that public policy into a reality, that is patients being able to go to dispensaries to get the medicine that they need, adults being able to go to dispensaries because they want to use marijuana recreationally, is to build a tremendous bureaucracy behind it. And so at Brookings, and in my work, I don't take a position on whether marijuana is a good thing or a bad thing. I have my own personal opinions about it, but I don't take a position in my work. We start, my colleagues and I work on this area, we start from a simple premise, that is, if the state decides to do this, they ought to get it right. And so we talk quite a bit about, again, that bureaucracy building, how to reform institutions so they work, how to make regulations work. Like I said, the really boring part behind a pretty exciting area of policy. In the process of this, I obviously read a lot on the topic to bring myself up to speed. This isn't something I'm trained in, this area of policy at least. And so I found there was this real gap in the literature, and that gap was an accessible discussion of the history of this policy. As we start to move forward with reform, and reform is moving at a very rapid pace in this country, we need to understand where it has been and what has weighed upon it, what has made marijuana policy in the US in some places something that is seen as taboo, or something that's seen as dangerous or a threat to society, and in other places something that's liberating, something that's a positive, something that the state can help make safe. And so the book is exactly as the subtitle suggests, a short history. It's not tremendously academic. It doesn't involve a lot of data, although there's a chapter on public policy that traces what has happened with public policy over the past 50 years. But it's meant as essentially a for dummies book for marijuana. It talks quite a bit about sort of prohibition, how prohibition came about, what the early history was like around the turn of the century, and it traces itself through to contemporary marijuana policy, that is reform, serious reform, meaningful reform, reform that is taking place in the most liberal of states and the most conservative of states simultaneously. There's 2 types of books that you can write when you're an academic. One type of book is one in which you sort of regurgitate what you already know. And the other type of book is one that you really learn a lot about as you start to do the research. My first book was one that I just regurgitated what I knew. It was turning my dissertation into a book. And that's rewarding. You get that off your desk. It's exciting. But to be able to jump into the details of this, I learned a lot about the people, the culture, the product itself, the means in which it's used. Is someone who admittedly has used marijuana in my life. I have used it in sort of the traditional ways, smoking it. But as you start to look at the recreational market, for instance, and even the medical market, the diverse ways in which marijuana is consumed, whether it's vaping, whether it's dabbing, whether it's other kinds of concentrates, edibles, creams, other tinctures, it's a fascinating industry, a fascinating market. But at the same time, it's not all that different than any other kind of market. It's a standard consumer good. It's sold in a variety of ways to people under a regulated system. And that might make it sound boring, but that boringness makes an important point, and it's an important point in this policy process, and that is that boring means it's real public policy. I get asked all the time, why is Brookings, the nation's oldest think tank, the think tank that's rated consistently #1 in the world, why are they looking at something like this? And that's the answer. It's public policy. It's real public policy. Medical marijuana initiatives and laws have now been reformed in states that have about 215 million Americans living in them. 1 in 5 Americans live in a state where that state has chosen to reform its laws to say that anyone over the age of 21 can access marijuana legally. Any other public policy in the United States that had an impact or had the opportunity to impact that many people would be studied by every policy organization in the world, every university in the world. But marijuana isn't. Marijuana remains taboo. The cultural biases that exist around this drug also biases research around this drug, this product, the plant, and the markets and institutions around it. So I'm lucky at Brookings. I don't have to take orders from superiors about what I do research on. And even though it's an old institution in terms of how long it's been around, we celebrated our 100th anniversary last month, it's also a place where I'm in the minority. There are not many of my colleagues who are my age. And as a result of that, there are implicit and explicit biases about studying a topic like this. For me, I come at this not as a marijuana advocate. I have no real advocacy interest in this whatsoever. But as someone who just finds it interesting and isn't scared, like several of my colleagues are, to engage in this debate. And the debate is fierce. And it touches on a lot of topics that don't normally come into the general conversation about marijuana. That is, aside from the regulatory things that I talked about, public health, public safety, access, issues of federalism. Issues of federalism sound like not dinner time conversation, not conversation you're going to chit-chat about in a coffee shop. But when you start to break that down and recognize what this means, it becomes a really serious governing question. So for instance, if you have a prescription for anything, let's say you have a sinus infection and you have a prescription antibiotic. You get it filled here at the infirmary or at CVS across the street. And then you go home for Christmas break. And let's say home is Ohio. That's simple. You take your antibiotic, you toss it in your carry-on, and you fly home to Ohio. But if you're a medical marijuana user here in Connecticut, accessing the industry through legal means, and you go get medicine for, let's say you have cancer, and you decide to travel somewhere, you can't bring your medicine with you. Why? Because federal law says that marijuana is illegal in every circumstance. No questions asked. It's a Schedule I substance. It's illegal everywhere in the United States. That means that even when a state reforms its laws and says that this is okay, you can't cross state lines with it. You also can't bring it to a state that has no medical marijuana laws on its books. And in most states, you can't even bring, even if you sneak it across the border, this fact that that state has reformed its medical laws doesn't mean that you can have medical marijuana from another place. So it means very serious questions about patient access, and patient advocacy groups rode horse, talking about the challenges that this presents. It also presents this very unique, I would say, perhaps the only place in American history where we have something that is absolutely unquestionably illegal federally, happening, being sold, being used, openly in front of the eyes of state leaders, fully legal. And so the way this works is a very odd, what I consider face-saving move by the federal government. The federal government recognized that to put an end to all state-level medical marijuana and recreational marijuana reforms would be an onerous task. It would be nearly impossible. And if there's one thing the federal government hates to do, it's to try something and to fail at it. So rather than trying to shut down dispensaries, grow operations, processors, and to arrest users in all of these states, they decided they'd put a patch in place, they'd fix this. So the Department of Justice issues guidance in 2011 and again in 2013 that says if a state performs its marijuana laws, for whatever reason, for whatever purpose rather, and they build a regulatory system, and the industry as it exists doesn't engage in certain bad acts like selling to children, sending product across state lines, working with drug cartels, etc., then the federal government is just going to take a hands-off approach and instruct U.S. attorneys, federal prosecutors, not to enforce the law. And so that creates this situation in which marijuana is illegal and legal at exactly the same time. Well, that creates these ripple effects and consequences of policy. For instance, if you are a marijuana grow in Colorado or a dispensary in Nevada, you are not treated like a normal business in the eyes of the federal government. You can't write anything off, almost anything off on your taxes. So a normal business, if they invest in itself, if they do research and development, if they build an addition onto their facility, those are tax rebates. They can write that off on their taxes. Not a marijuana industry. Not in the marijuana industry. Not a marijuana company. They're not able to do that. Why? Because it's illegal federally. Despite that, they're supposed to pay every penny that they owe in federal taxes, because even though they're an illegal enterprise, they are still due to pay tax revenue to the federal government. That's true for a prostitute, for a cocaine dealer, for a hitman. No matter what, you're still supposed to pay your taxes. But, like all of those other illegal operations, you can't write anything off. So it creates this odd dynamic that is causing a lot of problems in the industry. So if you talk to people in the industry, they'll tell you, for instance, that in their early years, some years, they'll have 125, 150, 175% tax burdens on their base revenue. It's a problem. It's a problem because it means only certain people can get into the industry. They tend to be white, male, old, and rich. Because you have to have that kind of cushion to be able to absorb losses like that over a series of years. Add to that, if you are operating in the marijuana industry, you don't have access to any banking services. You can't have a checking account, you can't have a savings account, you can't get a business loan, you can't get a line of credit. So that means you have to have a tremendous amount of liquid capital in reserve, not publicly held, ready to go to build these facilities. And I don't know if any of you have been to a marijuana grow operation. If you're ever in a state where it's legal, I really strongly encourage that you go. It is a fascinating trip. It's fascinating first to stand in a room with 10,000 pot plants in it, but it's also fascinating to see just how advanced the engineering is, how advanced the agriculture and the economics behind it are, and to see that this is sort of a normal business, except for the fact that they're growing a plant that's illegal. But back to the original point. In order to build these facilities, you need a lot of money. Some of these facilities cost $10, $12, $15, $20 million to build. There are state and local regulations that make this extremely difficult to stay in business. Licensure is profound. Here in Connecticut, to open a medical marijuana dispensary, you need to apply for licensure, which is tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. You also need to have $1.5 million held in escrow to show the state. That's before you even begin building. So who does that benefit? That benefits white, male, older, plain old guys. That creates this other dynamic that my book fleshes out a little bit, and that is the racial, cultural, ethnic, and gender dynamics that play out in this space. The industry tends only to be open to wealthier people and blocks out poorer people, people of color, women as well. But the racialized history of this plant, which spans nearly 100 years, really more than 100 years, shows that the disproportionate negative impact of marijuana enforcement in this country has hurt young people and people of color. There are efforts in the states to try to ameliorate some of these historical challenges, but they fall short because the barriers to entry in the industry are high. States like California. California passed Prop 64 on Tuesday, legalizing marijuana statewide. Part of that initiative allows individuals who are convicted of low-level marijuana offenses to apply to have their records expunged. That's great. It's going to help particularly communities of color, where in California, you're many, many times more likely to get arrested for a marijuana offense if you're from a community of color than if you're white, despite the fact that usage rates between whites and non-whites is identical. But the challenge still exists. That is, if you've been arrested for carrying a couple of joints in your pocket, that over the course of years, that closes off economic opportunities for you, educational opportunities for you, begins to hold you back. That's not an accident. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, why that's not an accident. But it means that the communities that have been hit hardest by marijuana enforcement in this country and marijuana policy status quo are the exact people who have the hardest time getting any benefits out of this industry. So why was this not an accident? Why was this racialization, this disproportionate enforcement to communities of color purposeful? It's because the history of the marijuana plant is an odd one. It began as a plant that was openly grown. In fact, in Virginia colony, before our founding, the cannabis plant used for hemp was a requirement. If you were a landowner, you were required to grow it by the British Crown. Later, it was a cash crop. You made everything with it: oil, food, linen, rope lines for ship sails, everything. And it was George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, they all grew the cannabis plant. Later, it became used for medicine. It was part of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, pretty much the Bible for pharmacists in the United States until 1942. But after the Spanish-American War, something interesting happened. A flow of immigration from Mexico began to hit our western states and western territories. The response, perhaps not so unique for its time, was that powerful officials in government began to slander Mexican immigrants. This may not sound familiar to you, but they were called murderers, they were called rapists, they were told that they were bringing drugs into white communities, they would turn white women promiscuous, particularly if they were in the company of men of color. Men of color was never the phrase that was used. And suddenly this plant that actually didn't have that much of a role in the early 20th century America began to get vilified. One individual in particular, who became the head of the Bureau of Narcotics in the Department of Treasury, was named Harry Anslinger. Harry Anslinger was an avowed racist. He used statistics, some of them made up, to push an agenda to grow his budget at the Bureau of Narcotics, which ended up becoming a precursor for, part of it went to what became the Drug Enforcement Administration, part of it went to the Office of National Drug Control Policy in the White House, to grow his budget and to enforce these laws in communities that he found suspect. First, it was Mexican communities, particularly along the US-Mexico border. Then, marijuana became a problem in the jazz communities. Jazz communities had nothing to do with music. It had everything to do with the color of your skin. Jazz communities were Harlem, in New Orleans, and placed in Chicago, in places that were seen by white America as a problem. This continued. Eventually, marijuana was banned, first effectively banned by a law in 1937, and then outright banned by the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. All along the way, you had presidents, Democrats and Republicans, seeing that they could divide this nation based on racial and ethnic lines and conquer political goals. This was done very effectively for quite some time. What began as something that was racial and ethnic continued to something that was social. In the 1950s, we had beatniks, and in the 1960s, we had hippies. And they were seen as outcasts. They were outsiders. They were outgroups who needed to be isolated and needed to be kept away from the good elements of society. All the while, racial differences in marijuana enforcement became staggering. The numbers of arrests for marijuana began to decline as states started to legalize a few years ago, starting in 2012. But up to that point, there were about 750 to 800,000 arrests in the United States every year for marijuana offenses. All the while, that was putting some people in jail, introducing some people to the criminal justice system, keeping some people from economic opportunity. Not necessarily because there was something inherently harmful about this plant. It's less addicting than alcohol or nicotine or caffeine, but because there was political gain to be made. And this became systematized in government. This was something that was not even seen as that there was even an alternative option. This became part of the fabric of governance and the fabric of political strategy in the US for quite some time. And if you look at public opinion, as I said, one chapter in the book traces public opinion, you see support for legalization was in the basement for decades, up until the late 1970s. What happened in the late 1970s? Jimmy Carter became interested in reforming marijuana laws. He was pushing, or getting ready to push, a nationwide marijuana decriminalization law. I don't know if it would have worked. In 1978, Jimmy Carter was working with a pretty big Democratic majority, which wasn't necessarily an A-OK for everything that he wanted, but it helped. But because of a scandal within the drug policy community within his administration, he had to step away from that reform. At that point, Gallup had been polling on marijuana policy for almost 20 years. And in 1978, support for legalization hit its peak, at least to that point. Carter steps away, he loses an election. Reagan gets elected in 1980. He's a fierce drug warrior. And he and his wife, both, First Lady Nancy Reagan, worked very hard to change the way Americans had started to think about drugs, and particularly marijuana. And by 1991, support for marijuana legalization in the United States was the same that it was in 1961. But something interesting began to happen in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And that was the AIDS epidemic. The AIDS epidemic, which was throughout the nation, particularly in urban areas, but it was happening throughout the nation, had its focal point in San Francisco, and particularly the Castro district of San Francisco, one of San Francisco's most famous gay communities. And that community was being ravaged by the AIDS crisis. And people started to find something interesting. If you use marijuana, it helped with the horrendous drugs that were being administered to AIDS patients at the time. They had terrible side effects. And it also helped with pain. The pain side has some precise biological processes by which this plays out. But if you have no appetite because the drugs you're taking are killing you, or because the nausea is so bad from the disease and from the side effects of the pharmaceuticals, you have essentially clinical anorexia. You can't put on weight. It's very dangerous if you have a suppressed immune system. And so what does marijuana do? This isn't a biologically complex process. It gives you the munchies. it allowed people to eat. And that helped them fight this disease for longer and to be more willing to take pharmaceuticals. And so there began the grassroots effort to reform medical marijuana laws in the United States. And by 1996, California became the first state to reform its medical laws. Many states followed after that. Many more conditions followed as qualifying conditions, a disease or an illness that you need to be able to access medical marijuana in your jurisdiction. And the conversation began to change. Starting at that low in 1991, support began to tick up continuously. And so now we're in a very different political and public opinion environment. Support for medical marijuana nationwide is over 80%. That's why on Tuesday, when 4 states voted on medical marijuana laws, those 4 states looked pretty different demographically and politically. Florida, Arkansas, North Dakota, and Montana. And all 4 passed. And all 4 passed by a lot. Nationally, 80% support. Support for recreational marijuana is at 61% nationally, where it stayed within that margin of error, 58, 59, 60, 61%, for about 3 years now. People are changing their minds. 2 things help. I'm going to wrap up on this and take your questions. But 2 things help in terms of changing public opinion. Really 3 things. First, the government rhetoric around this has changed dramatically. It's no longer the 80s era TV advertising, which a lot of you guys are too young to remember, which was laughable. People watched these ads and they just laughed at them. They weren't effective at all. The second is that more and more people in society have used marijuana at some point in their lives. And what do they recognize? They don't turn into murderers, they don't turn into rapists, they don't become other kinds of psychotics, they don't lose complete control over their productivity. And so the government lied on this, and they don't tend not to become addicted to it. Over 90% of people who use marijuana don't become addicted to it. So the government lied on this was something they couldn't believe any longer. So that helps change public opinion too. You use it, you realize it's not so bad, your opinion changes. It's true of everything. The third is a more complex process, and that's called generational replacement. The most supportive people for marijuana reform in the United States are you guys, millennials. I guess I count as a millennial too, but I'm much older than millennials. But millennials support adult use recreational legalization at over 80%. So the people who are 17 turning 18 have the highest levels of support for reform in the United States. The people with the lowest levels of support for reform, actually the only demographic group, the only demographic age group rather, in the United States with less than majority support are people 65 and over. Demographers, political scientists will tell you that group, so they supported about 35 to 38%. Demographers and political scientists will tell you those people are exiting the electorate. They're dying. And they're getting replaced by people with the highest levels of support. That's what motivated rapid change around same-sex marriage in the United States, as well as other things. And that's what's helping rapid change around marijuana reform. And so you end up in this situation with storied history of marijuana policy, a government that has spent a century vilifying this plant and its products for a variety of reasons. Suddenly, those messages are falling on deaf ears, and increasingly, people are becoming supportive of it, and that train keeps on plugging along. So it is 61% now, it will be significantly higher in 10 years, unless something traumatic and dramatic happens because of marijuana legalization. But short of that, this is a process where you can take a step back, look into the future, and see exactly where the people who support this, the states that are reforming this, and the underlying demographics tell you that this country's view of marijuana has changed dramatically, and it's going to change even more over time. So I'm going to stop there, though I could keep talking, but I'd be more than happy to take any of your questions.
Hi. To my knowledge, the American Medical Association is still opposed to legalizing marijuana for recreational purposes. I think they acknowledge that there are medical benefits, and there is a very prominent article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, widely considered the best medical journal in the United States 2 years ago, titled "The Adverse Effects of Marijuana." So
marijuana is something that is challenging for the medical community. The medical community in itself is very conservative when it comes to this topic. There are plenty of doctors who see medical benefit, not as broadly as the reform community would like them to. There are some people who will tell you marijuana will cure every disease under the sun. It grows bones, it grows tissue, it kills cancer, it does everything. But doctors, trained professionals, look at this skeptically, in part because they've been trained in medical schools for time immemorial. This is a bad thing, at least since the turn of the century. This is a bad thing. There are studies out there that suggest that it is helpful for pain, glaucoma, nausea, muscle spasticity disorders, especially things like epilepsy as well. But to rise to that standard of medical value is a difficult one. And to do research on marijuana, medical research on marijuana in the United States is very difficult. There are barriers to doing that research. There are both bureaucratic barriers, cultural barriers. It's hard to deal with university IRBs around this. It's a real challenge. And so good research isn't getting done. It's not that the answer is that marijuana doesn't have medical value. It's that we, in many cases, don't know if it has medical value. There are doctors in the 28 states and DC that have reformed their laws who are writing out recommendations for this for their patients every day. But there are a lot who won't, for a variety of reasons, but there are a lot who won't. And so, yeah, it's a real challenge. The AMA's position is that we need more research. That's what a lot of medical associations' position is. That's sort of an easy cop-out because everything could use more research. But DEA, the Department of Justice, ruled this summer on a rescheduling petition to try to remove marijuana from the highest level of control, Schedule 1, to a lower level of control, probably Schedule 2. They declined on the basis of there not being sufficient proof of medical value. The reform community was irate. It's probably the right decision because there just is not significant enough evidence, particularly for all of the conditions that it is recommended for in the United States. But it's a slow process. I think there are many more doctors in this country now who are willing to do this than 20 years ago when California reformed its laws. But when you're dealing with a community as scientifically rigorous and intellectually conservative as the medical community, I think it adds to what are the scientific, bureaucratic, and cultural barriers that exist ex ante around this plant, particularly for medical use.
So I think you touched on that financial institutions often don't give access to their products to dispensaries for, I guess, probably these still at the federal level. I was just wondering, what do you think the path forward is for dispensaries or growers to gain access to financial products?
Some states have been able to, or some members of the industry in certain states have been able to access this because banks are willing to take the lead. The Department of the Treasury in 2014 issued guidance from an agency called FinCEN that said pretty much what I said before about the Department of Justice guidance. If you've reformed and you're complying with regulations, blah, 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 we're not going to enforce banking regulations against these institutions. But bankers don't think that's sufficient enough cover. They're still worried about intervention, or they're still worried about themselves making mistakes that leaves them open for either prosecution or lawsuits or regulatory action. So it's a real challenge. Like I said, some banks have taken the lead. Many places they have not. And in places where the banks are allowing access, it is pretty much only to checking and savings accounts. In some places, it's only for checking accounts. And the fees that they charge per transaction are tremendous. I know a dispensary owner in Washington, D.C., and he says that every transaction that he makes at the bank has an extraordinary percentage and flat rate of fee on that. And so for him, it's in his interest to bring significant sums of money to the bank at one time rather than daily transactions just to lower those costs. But it's still burdensome for him. Beyond that, lines of credit, bank, business loans, things that any other business takes for granted are pretty much off the table. Your question was about the path forward. I argue that there's two paths forward. Either Congress is going to do something about this. Treasury has done pretty much all it's going to do unilaterally. I don't see the Federal Reserve as being interested in engaging in financial regulation around this, or I guess deregulation around this. So Congress is really the one who has to act and grant banking access nationwide, grant bankers that type of protection and cover. But there's another way too. It's a little bit more controversial, but I argue that it's going to take one big bank, Wells Fargo, though maybe they won't be in the business of it because of the scandal they've had recently, Bank of America, Chase, SunTrust, some bank like that, to step in and say very publicly, we're taking marijuana accounts now. If we've learned anything in the past 8 years, it's the federal government is not in the interest of jailing big bankers. And so I don't think they're going to do it over marijuana. I can imagine the CEO of Bank of America standing up and saying, if we operate in your state and you've reformed your laws and you're complying, we're taking your money. We'll be happy to do business with you. And see if the Treasury Department or the Federal Reserve is willing to risk the economic destabilization of freezing the accounts of Bank of America because they're taking checking accounts from compliant marijuana industry actors. That's risky. In some areas, bankers are more than willing to be risky. In other areas, they're very risk averse. This is an area where right now they're risk averse. But as the market expands, I think California coming online puts some pressure on banks to do this. It becomes financially incentivized to start taking this money. Before Tuesday, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska were the only states that had fully functional recreational marijuana markets. Colorado began sales in January of 2014, Washington in summer of 2014, Oregon this fall, and Alaska 2 weeks ago. These are still not just small markets, but young markets. So those financial incentives are not there. As the industry grows, I think the market forces are more likely to help this problem than the legislative forces will be. Yes?
Do you think it's ever going to be federally decriminalized? You talk about the support from millennials, but they're also the least likely demographic to vote, and also the people in Congress and legislature are also pretty conservative.
Yeah, even among some Democrats, there's still conservatism about this. Marijuana policy makes for strange bedfellows when it comes to partisan politics. If you look at some of the reforms that are proposed in Congress, it is some of the most conservative members of Congress joining together with progressives to push this. They come at it for different reasons, but they're doing that. So it's not something that cuts neatly across party lines, but you're right. Congress has not moved on this, even though, as I said at the outset, a lot of Americans live in states that have reformed their laws. They are hesitant to do anything about this, in part because they still buy into a lot of the drug war rhetoric that has been out there for decades. Part of it, too, is even though support is high for both medical and recreational marijuana, the issue doesn't have salience, right? So there's issue popularity, essentially. There's issue support, and then there's issue salience. For most of the country, marijuana reform isn't even a top 20 issue. You care about a lot of other things before you care about marijuana reform. So that push, that motivation for members of Congress to change their minds and really start to take this up isn't there. And that they have not taken it up and paid no political consequences for it just continues to reiterate the status quo. And so, will we eventually have marijuana reform nationally? Almost certainly. I mean, as I said, with the direction of public opinion in this country, it's bound to happen. You eventually get to some sort of critical mass, both within the public and in terms of the number of states. As I said, the financial incentive can be there for banks. The financial incentive can eventually be there for the federal government. If they start to reform around this, they can also levy taxes around it too. That might eventually help them. But right now, I mean, I won't predict the when, but I'm happy to predict that it's certain to happen eventually. I would say later rather than sooner. But eventually, I think it's something that can't be ignored.
Kind of, but, so what laws would have to be put in place if it were federally legalized? Because I know Colorado has had issues with driving, for example. So.
Sure. There would have to be, well, there's two approaches, right? You either do something piecemeal, where you reform a little bit here, a little bit there, and you eventually make your way toward everything being fixed. Or you have one sweeping bill, right? You could effectively think of it as like the Obamacare of marijuana legalization. There's a lot of issues in the system. You could fix them individually, or you could try to fix them all at once. Fixing them all at once is probably not the path that's going to be taken, but it would be the most effective one. There's a lot of argument about how the federal government should step in. The most convincing one I have heard is this idea of policy guardrails. That is, that the federal government sets a range of acceptable behavior among the states that states can experiment within. They can do what they want within this range. But as soon as you go outside of that, you're violating federal law. So it might be caps on potency of THC levels within marijuana. It might be regulations around pesticides or handling. It might involve tax rates. It might involve the conditions under which interstate commerce might happen. But then within those ranges, states are free to do what they want. That is probably how this is going to work. It's how it works on alcohol. There are a few federal regulations around alcohol. Some of them are sensible. Some of them are more particularistic, like the definition of bourbon and the definition of a small, a microbrewery. Those are both set by Congress. But beyond that, it is probably going to look like America's relationship to alcohol more than it's going to look like America's relationship to chickens or cows, I guess. So,
as we continue to see states legalize marijuana, business communities will have pretty much a zero tolerance policy towards its usage. If you fail a drug test, you're pretty much not going to get hired. And then in the NFL, for example, you get suspended, even though a majority of players know someone who's used the drug to combat pain. So how do you see the future of the business community accepting the drug as we legalize it?
the business community is loath to allow for exceptions to this. There are some employers who obviously do. If you talk to employers in Colorado, some of them are fine with either people testing positive as long as they're not showing up to work high, or they just don't test at all. But others don't want that exception. And most states who pass marijuana reform laws, whether it's by ballot initiative or through the legislature, they put into the language that businesses still have the right to have a zero tolerance policy. States that haven't, there have been court cases. So the most famous court case around this came out of Colorado. Colorado passed Amendment 64 in 2012, legalizing recreational marijuana. They were silent on this issue. And the medical marijuana initiative in 2000 was also. So there's this guy named Mr. Coates, and he works for DirecTV. He's a customer service agent at a call center for DirecTV in Denver. He is a paraplegic. He has a spinal cord injury, and because of that, he suffers pretty severe pain. He has a nearly 100% satisfaction rating as a customer service agent. He's never been written up for anything at work. He goes home at night, and he's a qualified patient in California has chronic pain and has spinal injury. And he uses medical marijuana for the pain, for pain relief. He doesn't use it before he goes to work. He doesn't ever show up to work high. He doesn't use it after. He only does it at home after work. He gets a random urine test, and he fails it. Presence of cannabinoids. Cannabinoids stay in the urine for quite some time, either active or inactive, but they stay for a much longer time than alcohol would or barbiturates or other drugs. So he gets fired. They have a zero tolerance policy at DirecTV. He sues. It makes its way up the chain. And eventually the Colorado Supreme Court rules on this, and they say employers have the right to enforce the drug policies that they want. This man's termination was completely compliant with the law, and Colorado's reforming of its medical marijuana laws has no impact on this whatsoever. This is a pretty sympathetic case. But it's also an amazing case. It's amazing because it leaves no gray area, right? If anyone in the state of Colorado was going to be entitled to an exception, it was this guy. The last thing you want is for a court of last resort to issue a ruling that businesses now say, I don't know what this means for us. Every business in the state of Colorado knows what this means for them. So in that case, it's sort of a gold standard ruling. If you're a qualified medical patient in Colorado, it's lousy for you. Most states have taken this approach. New Mexico has a more liberal policy around this. I think there's going to be a motivation for states to start testing better for potency or the sort of intoxicating level of cannabinoids in one's urine or in one's blood. They don't really know what that level is yet. I mean, normally you can talk to someone who's stoned and you know that they're stoned. But that's not always true, especially if you're really starting to come off it. And so until tests are better and thresholds are more pinpointed, I think businesses are just going to err on the side of, a lot of businesses are going to err on the side of zero tolerance. In the back.
As policy is decided at the congressional level, and I know that lobbying plays an important role in that, how is the interplay between different industries and the marijuana industry playing at the lobbying level? I mean, is there pressure from the health industry to contain the marijuana industry so far, or from other types of industries?
So you're right, lobbying is very important, and I think as the industry grows in size and in scope, there's going to be real opportunity for more lobbying from the industry, both at the state legislative level and regulatory level, and in Congress. That's not really there yet. There are some pretty big marijuana industry organizations, and they are still nascent. And I mean, they're impressive. I've spoken at a few of their conferences. They're huge. But compared to like a pharmaceutical conference or an agriculture conference or a defense contracting conference, these guys are. I mean, it's preschool what these guys are doing. But they're getting there. And so I think eventually they'll start wielding power. The part of your question about other lobbying organizations sort of combating this or helping this, there's real concern in the industry that big pharma, big alcohol, or big tobacco are going to start to throw their weight around. They believe they're going to throw their weight around in one of two ways. Either first, they start eating up industry, and that is big alcohol takes over the marijuana industry, or big tobacco does. We don't have evidence that that's happening right now. The other concern is they start preemptively trying to shut these systems down. They either start spending against initiatives, spending to lobby legislatures from passing reform, or getting themselves into the regulatory process to make the systems unworkable. We have a little bit of evidence from this year, from the 2016 race ballot initiatives, that there were some pharmaceutical companies starting to spend money. One pharma company, which was a pretty small pharmaceutical company, spent $500,000 in, I think, Arizona. There were smaller donations, $10,000, $25,000 here and there in Florida and in a few other places. But Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, those kind of companies are not engaging with the capacity that they have. And so I'm not convinced they're doing this. We have a little evidence that the incentive might be there or is starting to get there because a couple of studies have come out this year that have suggested a link, a negative correlation between marijuana use and opioid use. So one is this idea that marijuana can be used to wean people off of opioid dependency. That's going to hurt for pharmaceutical companies who really need opioid-dependent people to keep making money. The other is that in states with, and there is that study, I believe it came out of Columbia or Johns Hopkins, I forget which. That study was careful, properly careful in its conclusions to say this is not causal, it's suggestive, we can't rule everything out, but like a regular, like any study should, but especially like medical studies should. The other study showed that in states that have reformed medical marijuana laws, government reimbursements for opioid prescriptions have declined significantly. Again, correlation, not causation, but it suggests a motivation that pharmaceutical companies might eventually notice and start to react accordingly. Well, sir, here.
So for people that have been imprisoned in states that will proceed to legalize recreational use of marijuana, what does that look like for those people, for those individuals?
So it is rare that someone is imprisoned for low-level marijuana offenses. Usually, if they are in prison and there is a low-level marijuana offense involved, it is in concert with other larger offenses. But usually, if you have broken the law and you are in prison for marijuana, it's because you've done something pretty big and pretty bad that is still probably illegal in your state. Trafficking, sales to minors, things like that. But that's not universally true. There are people who are serving time in prison for low-level marijuana offenses. They tend to be in states that haven't reformed their laws. You can imagine the likelihood of reform is negatively related to the toughness of your marijuana laws. But in states where people have this on their record, either maybe they spent a short time in jail or they just did community service and paid a fine or whatever the thing is, they can go to the court and apply to have something expunged or retroactively removed from their record in whatever way. Like I said, that's great moving forward, but for people who have already dealt with the hardships that go along with an arrest record like that, you can't undo the past. And so there are some states that are seriously thinking about this. You have also seen some movement among governors to consider pardons of people like this. President Obama has actually been very good about pardoning federal drug offenders who he considers to have been disproportionately sentenced for the level of the crimes that they had. But this is a very piecemeal system, state by state, issue by issue, case by case. The president has about 60 days left in office. He's not going to pardon all of the people who fall into that category. I mean, I guess he could, but I doubt he will. And states just haven't figured out the right formula, I think, to advance the criminal justice reform aspect of that retroactive get-out-of-jail-free card.
I know look at just states around the world, but how are we compared to other countries like in their progressive marijuana usage and legalities?
So we use a lot of marijuana compared to other nations in terms of usage rates. In terms of reform, there are several countries that have reformed medical marijuana laws, not as necessarily aggressively as we have at the state level, but several have. The Netherlands obviously has a very weird look the other way system where cannabis is sold and used in cafes. It is actually illegal to do that, but the government is choosing not to enforce it. The only country in the world that has legalized marijuana is Uruguay. Their system is in the process of getting off the ground. I was there in August. It is a very rocky process to get that system off the ground, and it's designed in a challenging way for it to be effective. The challenge that nations have is that legalizing marijuana at the national level is in direct violation of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, an international treaty that bans marijuana for recreational use as well as controls drugs in a variety of other ways. So that becomes a challenge. But Canada is considering legalization. Mexico Supreme Court has issued a ruling that home grows are legal in that country. Other nations are starting to think about reforming their laws, not just on medical, though some are on medical, but also on recreational. But drug use generally, worldwide, is something that is frowned upon quite a bit, even marijuana use. And so you'll see a few countries here and there over the next 10 years start to legalize. But this is not something that will be sweeping. This is not something that is culturally, religiously, ethnically accepted in most places. And so you'll see some Western countries, perhaps a few other countries do this, but it's still going to be pretty taboo on the international stage. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you all for coming. The bookstore is here, and they do have copies of John's book available for purchase, and we'll speak for him and say that he will be happy to sign a copy. Buy one for you, buy one for your parents.